Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was a land of secrecy, fear, and control. But what few in the West know is that even the most innocent place, the school, carried its own horrors. From punishments that broke children's spirits, to secret experiments hidden inside classrooms, and even ghost stories whispered in the dormitories today, we uncover the dark, forgotten history of Soviet schools. Some schools carried darker reputations. In rural regions, whispers spread about schools built on old prisons, or even cemeteries. Children swore they heard footsteps in empty corridors, or saw shadows where no one stood. Whether truth or imagination, these stories spread like wildfire, a hidden form of rebellion against the silence of the system. But there were also real horrors. Archival documents reveal that during the 1950s and 60s, some Soviet schools were used as testing grounds, not for education, but for psychology experiments, sleep deprivation, isolation exercises, and even food rationing were conducted under the excuse of studying child development. Many of these projects were quietly buried when results proved too disturbing. For children in boarding schools, the nightmare was worse. Thousands of Soviet kids were sent far from home, living in strict dormitories with rigid rules. Lights out meant silence, but not always sleep. Older children bullied the younger, teachers ignored complaints, and many recall the sound of footsteps, at night footsteps, that belonged to no one. In one infamous case from the 1970s, students in a Leningrad boarding school began reporting the same dream: a tall man in a grey coat standing at the foot of their beds. Soon after, several children refused to sleep, terrified of the figure. Officials dismissed it as hysteria, but local archives hint at something else. The building had once been used as a wartime hospital, where hundreds had died in agony. Beyond ghost stories, there were darker scandals. In some schools, teachers abused their authority in ways that today would spark outrage. Yet in the Soviet Union, complaints often disappeared, parents were silenced, and children were told to endure. Only after the USSR collapsed did survivors begin to speak openly, revealing decades of hidden trauma. But perhaps the most shocking revelations are linked to secret police surveillance. It may sound like fiction, but declassified KGB reports confirm that even school children were watched for signs of anti-Soviet thought. Teachers were instructed to report suspicious behavior, jokes about the government, interest in Western music, or even asking too many questions. A careless word in class could bring the weight of the state crashing down on a family. Today, many of these Soviet schools stand abandoned. Their walls are covered in graffiti, their windows shattered, their classrooms filled with silence. Yet explorers and urban adventurers claim that silence is not empty. Strange noises echo through the halls. Personal belongings left behind seem frozen in time. And some even believe the spirits of forgotten children linger, forever trapped in the place that stole their youth. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the horror of Soviet schools is undeniable. The fear, the control, and the silence marked generations of children. For them, the classroom was not a sanctuary. It was a shadowed stage where nightmares took shape. And so we ask, how many more secrets lie buried in the ruins of Soviet education? Were these just the scars of a brutal system, or something darker? Something that still haunts the empty halls today. This was Horror and History, USSR. If you want to uncover more of the secrets hidden behind the Iron Curtain, join us in the next episode where the shadows only grow darker. The history of Soviet schools is often remembered through numbers: millions of students, thousands of buildings, endless lessons of mathematics and ideology. But behind those numbers are stories buried in silence. Stories that reveal how fear can seep into even the most ordinary places. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many survivors finally found the courage to speak. What they revealed was not a system of learning, but a system of control. Some described it as a prison, others compared it to a laboratory, and some, even today, refuse to talk at all, as if the memories themselves are too dangerous. In many cities, The schools were towering buildings of stone and concrete, designed to look eternal. Long corridors, high ceilings, rows of identical classrooms. At first glance, nothing unusual, but former students often speak of the atmosphere. The smell of dust and chalk mixed with damp walls, the cold echo of footsteps that followed too closely, and the way silence seemed heavier than it should have been. One man, now in his 70s, remembers walking those halls in the late 1950s. He said that even as a child he felt the building itself was watching him. The teachers punished us, yes, he recalls, but the worst punishment was being sent to the basement. They called it a storeroom, but it was cold, dark, and the door locked from the outside. You could hear scratching in the walls, like fingernails. Though we told ourselves it was only rats, rumors spread quickly among children. Some schools were said to have hidden rooms where officials kept files on every student. Others had cellars that once held prisoners during the war, cellars that teachers never mentioned, but every child knew existed, and every school had its own ghost story. In Ukraine, there was talk of a school where the portrait of Lenin on the wall would fall whenever a student was about to die. In Belarus, children swore that in one abandoned classroom, the chalkboard wrote messages by itself. In rural Russia, parents whispered about a school built over a mass grave, where students fainted without reason and complained of voices calling their names. Were these just stories, or were they the only safe way for children to express what they felt? That their schools were haunted, not just by spirits, but by the weight of fear itself. The truth is that Soviet schools were more than places of education. They were arenas of obedience. Every child learned to repeat slogans, memorize speeches, and raise their hand at the right time. But what they didn't realize was that they were also part of an experiment in control. Documents reveal that researchers often visited classrooms, pretending to observe lessons. In reality, they measured how long children could sit still without speaking, how quickly they obeyed commands, and how they reacted when isolated from their peers. Some teachers were complicit, others claimed ignorance, but all of it fed into a system that wanted to know one thing: how to shape the perfect Soviet citizen. The most chilling detail comes from the 1960s. A classified report describes night exercises in certain boarding schools, where children were woken at random hours, marched outside into freezing air, and told to stand silently in rows until sunrise. Any child who cried or collapsed was labeled weak. No one knows how many suffered permanent damage, because the records end abruptly. The experiment was considered unsuccessful and buried, but memories cannot be buried. Survivors recall shivering until their lips turned blue, hearing the sobs of classmates in the dark, and looking up at teachers who stood like statues, refusing to speak. One man said, "We thought we were preparing for war. Now I think they were preparing us for something much worse." And then there are the disappearances. Not every child who entered a Soviet school left it. Parents whispered about sons and daughters sent to special facilities after displaying unusual behavior. Officially, these were hospitals for the mentally ill. Unofficially, no one ever saw those children again. One story tells of a boy in Leningrad who asked too many questions about his missing uncle, an uncle who had been arrested by the secret police. Within weeks, the boy himself was gone. His classmates were told he had been relocated. No address was given. His name was removed from the register. These vanishings were never acknowledged, but the fear they created was real. For the children who remained, the lesson was clear: forget what you saw, and never speak of those who disappeared. Even today, decades later, people living near abandoned Soviet schools tell unsettling tales. Urban explorers describe walking through shattered corridors and finding rooms that don't appear on any map, locked doors behind which faint noises can be heard, staircases that lead nowhere, and sometimes desks still covered with books, as if the students had vanished mid-lesson. One explorer recalls entering a collapsed school in the Urals. In the rubble of a classroom, he found a child's shoe, small, red, still neatly tied. Next to it lay a notebook, the last line scrawled, "He's coming." The handwriting stopped there. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when the explorer showed the notebook to locals, they refused to touch it. One old woman simply crossed herself and said, "That school should have been burned, not abandoned." The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. Soviet schools were not simply institutions of learning. They were vessels of control, places where fear took root, and sometimes places where something far darker waited in the shadows. The silence of abandoned classrooms is not empty. It carries echoes of what once happened inside these walls. For many children, even walking into a school meant entering a place of shadows, shadows that stretched far beyond the mere discipline of teachers. In some towns, entire generations were molded, not just by lessons, but by fear, mystery, and an unspoken understanding that the walls themselves were watching. In a small village near Novgorod, children swore that the music room was cursed. Every evening, the piano would begin to play by itself. Some said it was the ghost of a girl who had drowned in the nearby river decades earlier. Others whispered that a teacher, long gone, had left behind a hidden warning, a diary never found, and that the piano played her words, repeating them in a melody only the students could hear. Psychological experiments left scars that went beyond the official reports. Former students described being tested not only for obedience, but for emotional response. Teachers would suddenly vanish from the classroom, replaced by strangers in grey suits, who would observe silently as children were asked to describe their fears in front of the class. Those who hesitated or stuttered were punished, humiliated, or isolated for days. The goal, insiders said, was to measure submission, to track how quickly a child could be trained to fear authority. Boarding schools were especially brutal. Children lived under strict schedules, waking hours measured in minutes, with every movement recorded. The older students often became enforcers of the rules, and bullying was not only tolerated, but subtly encouraged. One student recounted how a group of teenagers forced a younger boy to sit in a closet for an entire night, chanting the national anthem over and over, as punishment for asking a question the teacher didn't like. Legends grew alongside these horrors. In Siberia, one school was rumored to have been built on the site of a secret prison from the 1940s. Children reported that the dormitory walls whispered names at night, and some swore they could see figures standing at the windows, watching silently before vanishing. Teachers would tell the students these were just shadows, tricks of the mind, but no explanation ever fully reassured them. Even the mundane objects in schools carried fear. Desks carved with cryptic symbols, books with pages missing, and chalkboards that seemed to retain messages long after the class had ended. In one account from a street, Petersburg, a teacher left a stack of homework overnight. When she returned, the papers had been rearranged to form a phrase she did not recognize. "They are still here." The Soviet secret police's reach extended even into these classrooms. Children were monitored for the slightest hint of disobedience or curiosity. In some cases, students were taken from their families for questioning simply for writing a story about the past. One diary, discovered decades later in an abandoned school, detailed a young boy's fears of the inspectors who listened through the walls, recording his every word. His handwriting became increasingly frantic until the final line, "I cannot tell them anything, or they will take me too." Haunting stories of missing children were not limited to rumors. Multiple schools reported students who simply vanished without explanation. Parents were often warned not to ask questions, and classmates were told to forget them. Some of these children were later found in state institutions, isolated from their peers, sometimes never returning home. Others were never seen again. The fear was compounded by the architecture itself. Soviet schools were often designed with long, narrow hallways and identical classrooms, making it easy for authorities to monitor children, while also creating a sense of disorientation. Staircases led to dead ends, doors opened to brick walls, and basements were common locations for secret disciplinary actions. Many children who walked these halls reported an almost tangible presence, an awareness that something beyond human supervision watched them at all times. Even after lights out, children rarely felt safe. Ghostly footsteps, cold drafts that carried whispers, and distant knocks became part of the routine. One former student in Siberia described an incident where several children awoke to find that their beds had been moved, lined in a perfect circle, and an unfamiliar figure standing silently in the corner of the room. No one ever explained who it was, and the children never forgot the sight. In cities across Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, abandoned schools now stand as eerie monuments to this past. Broken windows, shattered furniture, and peeling paint are all that remain of places once filled with the laughter and fear of children. Urban explorers report strange phenomena: doors that lock behind them, chalk writing that appears overnight, and faint voices calling names that no longer exist. Some of these explorers claim that the schools are alive in a sense that is impossible to describe, as if the memories of the children who suffered there are still trapped, repeating endlessly. It is in these ruins that the full weight of the Soviet education system becomes visible. The classrooms, once designed to shape minds, instead became containers of secrets, fear, and sorrow. And even today, long after the system has fallen, the remnants of these schools whisper of control, loss, and the trauma that generations of children carried into adulthood. Some researchers now believe that the psychological damage inflicted in these schools may still echo through families today. Survivors recount nightmares, panic attacks, and unexplainable anxiety linked directly to experiences in these institutions. Stories of bullying, isolation, and punishment are repeated across towns and decades, suggesting a system so thorough that its effects remain even after its collapse. Time moves differently in the abandoned schools of the former Soviet Union. Decades have passed, but the silence does not feel empty. It feels deliberate, as if the walls themselves remember everything that happened within them. Explorers who enter these ruins report an atmosphere thick with memory and dread, a place where the past refuses to stay buried. One abandoned school near Smolensk became infamous among urban explorers. The windows were shattered, desks overturned, and papers littered the floors. Yet what unsettled visitors most were the footprints. Dozens of small footprints leading from classroom to classroom, stopping suddenly in the hallways. No child had been seen there for over 30 years. Some claimed they could hear whispers, faint singing, and even the soft tapping of chalk on blackboards. Stories like this are common. In one boarding school outside of Moscow, a former janitor recounted that every night, objects moved inexplicably. Chairs would slide across floors, doors creaked open, and sometimes beds appeared to shift positions overnight. Some children who slept in these dormitories had nightmares of a grey-clad man watching them silently, a figure which was eerily consistent with reports from decades earlier. Officials dismissed these stories, but the survivors remember vividly. Even in the most mundane classrooms, students sometimes reported phenomena that defied explanation. Chalkboards would carry messages not written by anyone, books opened to pages they hadn't left open, and the scent of something familiar yet distant, the smell of old wood, ink, and something more bitter, would linger long after the last lesson had ended. The psychological experiments conducted decades ago traces deeper than researchers ever anticipated. Children were often isolated, tested, and observed in ways that broke trust and shaped behavior through fear. Some survivors recall being forced to memorize passages, repeat slogans, and perform absurd rituals under the watchful eye of instructors in grey coats. Those who faltered were disciplined publicly, humiliated, or sent away for a further observation. Many still suffer from memories that return in dreams. The endless repetition, the invisible scrutiny, the sense that the walls themselves judged them. Among the most chilling reports are accounts of students who vanished without explanation. In rural regions, children were sometimes taken from their classrooms in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Families were given no answers. Other times, Children were sent to secret facilities disguised as hospitals or boarding schools, where isolation and experimentation continued. The fear this created spread quietly among the children, a silent understanding that asking questions could cost more than embarrassment. It could cost your existence. These stories blurred the line between reality and legend. Ghostly sightings, strange voices, and inexplicable phenomena became part of life in and around the schools. One surviving teacher from Leningrad recalled a classroom where, late at night, the students' shadows moved independently of their bodies. At first, she told herself it was fatigue or imagination, but the children insisted it was real. Some even refused to return, claiming that the building itself had a will of its own. Abandoned schools today remain silent witnesses to these events. Urban explorers document peeling walls, broken desks, and personal items left as if time stopped mid-lesson. Notebooks filled with half-finished homework, shoes lined neatly by doors, and sometimes letters scribbled with urgent messages that were never delivered. Many who enter these buildings report a sensation of being watched, hearing footsteps behind them when no one is there, and feeling a weight on their shoulders that has no visible source. One particularly harrowing story comes from a former boarding school near Vladivostok. A group of children reportedly began to dream the same recurring nightmare, a grey figure standing at the foot of their beds, silently observing. The dreams were so intense that children refused to sleep, fell ill, and became unable to study. Officials dismissed the phenomenon as mass hysteria, but diaries recovered decades later hint at a far darker reality. The school had once been a makeshift military hospital where hundreds had died, their suffering never recorded or acknowledged. These tragedies, whether supernatural or psychological, left indelible marks on the survivors. Many carry lifelong trauma, nightmares, and an uneasy awareness that their experiences were part of a system built on fear, obedience, and observation. The schools, once meant to shape young minds, instead became vessels of cruelty and secrecy. And yet, the ruins themselves continue to tell stories. Explorers and photographers report strange occurrences, chalk writing appearing overnight, lockers opening on their own, or the faint echo of children's laughter when the buildings are otherwise empty. Some believe these are spirits of the forgotten children, trapped in a place where their youth was stolen. Others think the energy is less supernatural, more the lingering imprint of trauma, encoded in walls that have absorbed fear over decades. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that much of this history remains unknown. Many files remain sealed, survivors remain silent, and local legends are often dismissed as children's imaginations. But the whispers persist. The reports of strange footsteps, moving shadows, and vanished students continue to surface, even in modern times. It raises the question, how many more stories are hidden in the rubble, waiting to be discovered? How many children's lives were altered forever by the schools meant to educate them? And what truly haunts these places? The memory of fear and control, or something darker that has never been explained? For those brave enough to enter these abandoned halls today, the answer is unclear. Every creaking floorboard, every broken desk, and every forgotten notebook are a reminder that the past is not truly gone. It lingers, watching, waiting, and whispering secrets that many would prefer remain hidden. The horror of Soviet schools was not only in the punishments, experiments, or disappearances, it was in the silent lessons taught every day. The lesson that every word, every action, and every thought could be monitored, judged, and punished. That lesson shaped generations, and its echoes can still be felt in the empty classrooms, broken windows, and hallways filled with shadows. And so, we leave the ruins behind, but the questions remain. How many more secrets lie buried in these buildings? How many spirits, memories, and shadows linger, waiting to be uncovered? And what does it truly mean when the place that was supposed to teach children becomes a stage for nightmares that refuse to end? This was Horror and History, USSR. The past is never truly past, and in the silent halls of abandoned schools, The shadows are still very much alive,